We have two items on the agenda today. The fiscal 15 Homeland Security Appropriations Bill.
And while this bill takes good steps to fight human trafficking and the tragic increase in unaccompanied alien children at our borders, $205.7 million is unnecessarily set aside for the misguided policy of mandating a set number of detention beds, which wastes valuable money that could best be used elsewhere to protect our nation.
Are there additional amendments, Mr. Quigley? Clerk will read.
If we could dispense with the reading, Mr. Chairman.
Which amendment is it, sir?
Amendment number 1.
Amendment offered by Mr. Quigley. Page 11, strike the proviso beginning on line 21.
Dispense with the reading.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, when I describe this committee's work to my constituents, I like to refer to what we are doing as making smart investments. We have limited, lately very limited, money to invest, and this committee makes tough choices of what programs offer the American taxpayer the best return on their investment. With that in mind, I'm offering an amendment with Congressman Serrano and Congressman Honda to end what I believe is an outdated idea that we have supported for too long at too high a price, the detention bed mandate. I intend to offer and withdraw this amendment because I can count votes, and I know that we still have some work to do on this issue. But given the high cost of maintaining an arbitrary 34,000 detention beds, especially when in many cases there are more humane, more cost-effective, secure alternatives available, I think this is a worthy conversation to have here. Now, I appreciate that we have made some significant progress on this issue. I'm glad that Chairman Carter, Secretary Johnson, and I agree that this mandate is a requirement to maintain these beds, not a mandate to fill these beds. It's also promising that we have begun to more appropriately fund alternatives to detentions in this bill. It is clear from the growing number of immigrants that we are detained each year that DHS still relies on this language when making many custody decisions. Custody decisions should be made on an individual basis following a calculus of flight risk, risk to public safety, and other relevant humanitarian considerations. They shouldn't be based on this committee's report language. Even though having these beds doesn't mean we have to fill them, it does mean we have to pay for them. Instead of spending an average of $164 per day on detention, we should be utilizing more humane, cost-effective, and secure alternatives to detention for as little as 30 cents to $14 per day. We need to get rid of the detention bed mandate so we can give more flexibility to the use of detention funds for alternatives to detention. Allowing increased flexibility in making custody decisions would allow DHS to better use its resources, result in less unnecessary separation of families, and provide cost saving to the American taxpayer. Mr. Chairman, this isn't a partisan issue. An amendment to strike the detention bed mandate offered on the floor last year was supported by a significant number of members of this committee from both sides of the aisle. We need to spend smarter when it comes to immigrant detention and eliminate the detention bed mandate. This is an important first step.
Did the gentleman say he wishes to withdraw this?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would like my colleagues who are with me on this to be able to speak on the matter before we withdraw, just to give them this few minutes. Thank you.
Mr. Serrano. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of this amendment and thank Mr. Quigley, Mr. Honda for working with me on this. The detention bed mandate is one of the most onerous and wasteful provisions in this bill. We're spending money maintaining and filling space in immigration detention centers that the Department of Homeland Security has said they don't need and that the numbers don't back up. The goal of the DHS detention system is to ensure immigration court appearances for immigrants who are threats to public safety, who are significant flight risk. The vast majority of immigrants do not fall into this category. The fact is that the vast majority of undocumented immigrants, if asked to appear before an immigration court, will do so, no questions asked. There are many cheaper, more economical forms of monitoring for these individuals. But in too many cases, we're simply wasting money on more expensive, unnecessary detentions. According to this bill, we have had to increase the custody operations account information points on Quigley Serrano Honda detention bill mandate by $171 million to accommodate the detention bed mandate. It is far smarter and more fiscally responsible to determine the number of detention spaces necessary. In short, this bill is unnecessary. The gentleman is going to withdraw it, but I really feel that this is one area where even the Department of Homeland Security has told us that they don't need this money, that they don't need to be doing this, and yet we insist on doing it. So I would hope that as we move forward into conference, we could just get rid of this provision and do the right thing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I rise in support of the gentleman's amendment, which would strike the requirement of the bill that ICE maintains 34,000 detention beds each day. To meet this quota, ICE is forced to find immigrants to detain immigrants who could otherwise be released. It must continue operating facilities with track records of abuse that should be closed. Detention is the most expensive way for dealing with the problem. It costs taxpayers nearly $160 per day per detained immigrant. In fiscal year 2014, this will total about $2 billion, and by contrast, release under supervision or placement in alternatives to detention, such as bond or parole, costs less than $17 per day per person. The quota keeps ICE from using less costly alternatives to detention and forces ICE to continue operating facilities to maintain an arbitrary number of beds. No other law enforcement agency is forced to operate on a quota system, yet we require ICE to do so, tearing apart families and communities in the process and wasting taxpayer money. We must end this practice. That is why I support the gentleman's amendment.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate this amendment coming up. I do support this amendment, and I appreciate the conversation being started. We have to think outside the box, and this is an opportunity to think outside the box where we can come up with more affordable ways of housing these people. The mandate is not the right way to have policy in place, and this is an opportunity for us to have this conversation. So thank you for bringing it up, and look forward to working with you on the future on this. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I appreciate my colleagues' thoughtful remarks on this matter. Just a quick parallel. There's not a county jail in this country, in my understanding, that doesn't have alternatives to detention, largely based on still keeping this public safe, but dealing with the reality of being cost-effective. So just understand there's a reasonable alternative to do what you want to do. And I'm hoping that in conference we move forward on this, and I appreciate your time and consideration, Mr. Chairman, and I withdraw the amendment at this time.